Welcome and thank you for coming. I am Don Hugh, the Director of the Center for Ethics and Human Values, and the Center for Ethics and Human Values is the unit that runs the Compass program. We describe Compass stands for Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society, as a year-long university-wide conversation on some topic that raises controversies and raises foundational moral questions, but requires the input of many different disciplines to address adequately. The topic for this year's Compass program is religion, or religion in public life, or a fuller name. We're addressing a variety of questions, including the historical development of religious toleration, the role of religion and pluralism in domestic and global politics, religion as a cause of violence and as a force for peace, religious and secular understandings of human equality and social justice, the relationship between religious and scientific modes of understanding, and the prospects for interreligious cooperation to address the challenges such as global poverty and environmental degradation. There's a slideshow that's been going in some of our upcoming events, but I want to highlight one in particular. On the evening of November 6th, we will be presenting Francis Fitzgerald, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, who's written a book recently on the history of evangelicalism in the U.S., and especially the role it has played in politics. And that event will be at the Fawcett Center in the evening so that we can attract lots of people from the community as well as university people. Following Ms. Fitzgerald's talk, we'll have a panel discussion with Tim Ahrens, who is the minister at the First Congregational Church downtown, and Rich Nathan, who is the pastor of the Vineyard, talking about evangelicalism in the U.S. and the roles played in politics. Today's panel is focused on new religions and the law. We have a fall conference where we address questions of is there anything special about religious freedom, and what are the limits of religious freedom? And that question rather obviously raises the issue of what do we mean by religion in the first place, which is, I think, a vexed question. Part of the reason it's such a difficult question to address is that the best way to understand religion, I think, depends upon what questions you're trying to answer. So what might be an appropriate understanding of religion for a sociologist and an anthropologist might not be an appropriate understanding for a psychologist, or a philosopher, or for a lawyer. One of the questions that I think today's panel will address has something to do with how we ought to be thinking, how we do think, and how we ought to be thinking of religion in the legal context. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's conversation, and he will introduce our panelists. The moderator is Terrance, who's a graduate student of the Department of Religion at Vanderbilt University, and we have the benefit of his presence for this year as a visiting scholar in African American and African Studies. He is a widely published author, having published articles in Huffington Post, essays, and books, and a number of other publications as well. So let me introduce Terrance here, and Terrance will introduce our two speakers.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? This is my phone. There we go. My radio voice. Good evening, good afternoon, welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining us for this wonderful conversation on new religious movements. To my immediate left right here is Hugh, a distinguished professor of comparative studies and director of the Center for the Study of Religion here at The Ohio State University. His primary areas of research are religions of South Asia and new religions in the United States. He is the author of 9 books, including Tantra, Sex, Secrecy, Politics, and Power in the Study of Religion, and the Church of Scientology, a history of a new religion. And to my immediately far left, I'll do that and then we'll get to the presentation. Spencer Dew is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Religious Studies at Centenary College of Louisiana. His first book, emerging from his dissertation at the University of Chicago Divinity School, was Learning for Revolution, the work of Kathy Acker, an examination of claims of Jewish identity and Jewish textual influence on that novelist's understanding of art's political and utopian functions He is currently on sabbatical, finishing a book, Sovereign States, Religion, Citizenship, and Law, which argues for the centrality of the work of citizenship and law as both ideal and practice across a range of African American religious communities, indebted to the thinking of 20th century thinker Noble Drew Ali. His next project, Appeal to Heaven, Law as Religion in America, continues to focus on religious imaginings and engagements with the legal, this time across a range of communities from neo-Confederates and Three Percenters to African American and Native American movements. Spencer did. And our first presentation will be by Professor Hugh Urban. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. So I was asked to speak about new religions in American law, focusing on the Church of Scientology and the question of tax exemption. And I'm going to be drawing for this presentation on my book on the Church of Scientology. I have a handout to send around. So I want to start out by just saying a few words about how I understand new religious movements, what they are. And I'm relying here on J. Gordon Melton, who's a scholar of new religious movements who's written quite a lot about them. And he finds essentially groups that have emerged since the mid-19th century that either present themselves or are perceived as alternatives to mainstream American religions. And I put mainstream in scare quotes because what's mainstream is a fairly subjective kind of decision. He's cataloged over 2,000 individual religious groups in the United States, only half of which are Jewish or Christian. So in addition to every denomination of Christianity and Judaism, we also have various forms of Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Jainism, Sikhism, and we also have hundreds of religious movements, which include everything from the Church of Scientology, the Moorish Science Temple, the Nation of Islam, Hare Krishnas, various forms of Neo-Paganism, like Druidism, UFO-based religions, like aliens, and many others. And one reason I'm interested in new religious movements is that even though they're small in size and few in numbers, they've often had a significant impact on how we think about and define the category of religion, and also, in many cases, have helped reshape U.S. law. A few obvious examples. First, Mormonism and polygamy. In 1878, the Supreme Court reached a key decision, the Reynolds decision, to determine that the First Amendment to the Constitution may mean that you can believe anything that you want, but you can't do anything that you want. Right? So you can believe in the Book of Mormon or any other sacred text, but you can't engage in practices that violate existing law, like anti-bigamy. Another example is the case of the Branch Davidians, who were a Christian religious movement that had an apocalyptic worldview and ended in a violent showdown with the FBI and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms in 1991. And the FBI received such intense criticism for how they handled this catastrophe that it forced them to revise their own thinking about how they deal with alternative religious groups. And now the FBI actually meets every year at the annual Conference of the American Academy of Religion with religious scholars to talk about how they should deal with this. There are lots of other examples that I could mention. We can talk about them afterwards if you like. But I'm going to focus for this presentation on Scientology. There are many complex legal debates that Scientology has raised, and I'm going to focus for this presentation just on the question of tax exemption. So just a few words about the origins of Scientology. Scientology was founded by this guy, L. Ron Hubbard, who was born in Tilden, Nebraska in 1911. And in his early years, he was a hugely prolific author of science fiction, fantasy, and adventure stories. He was probably the most prolific author of sci-fi tales in the 30s and 40s, the golden age of science fiction. There were hundreds of stories under his own name and under various pseudonyms. But then in 1950, he turned his attention from science fiction to what he called the new science of the human mind, which he termed Dianetics. He took the term Dianetics from Greek dia, meaning through, and nous, mind, and he had Dianetics that all our problems come through the mind, and therefore all of our problems can be solved through the mind. It was first published in an issue of Astounding Science Fiction in 1950, and later in book form that same year, sold millions of copies, was at the top of the New York Times bestseller list, and really was the first hugely popular form of self-help therapy in the United States. The key point is that Dianetics initially made no claim to be a religion. It was presented simply as a form of self-help therapy. So the key practice in Dianetics and also in later Scientology is called auditing, which is kind of like a therapy session in which you work with an auditor who does sort of counseling, and then the individual being audited will talk through his various problems to determine where they have trouble areas in their lives. To aid in auditing, Hubbard developed a device called the e-meter, the electropsychometer, which is designed to register where you have problem areas in your life as you're talking to the auditor. And it works like a lie detector, essentially, that measures your galvanic skin response to detect where you have trouble areas that we work through that session. Now, in 1953, Hubbard returned from Dianetics and sort of morphed into what became the Church of Scientology, because now it's as a church and as a religion, using the Scientology cross as its main symbol. And there are two reasons that this turn for religion happened. First, in the course of auditing, as they're going through this kind of therapy session, many individuals claim that they were remembering past lives, previous incarnations on this world and other worlds. So Hubbard developed the idea of a spiritual self, what he called the Phaeton, which is eternal and has multiple incarnations. So in addition to a body and a mind, you also have a Phaeton or a spiritual self. The other reason he went in the religion direction was more practical. Basically, in Dianetics, he claimed that you could have various forms of physical healing, that you could cure colds and never become sick. And the FDA and various state medical boards began to charge members with practicing medicine without a license. And so by going in the religious direction, Hubbard's saying this is not a form of physical healing, it's actually spiritual healing, which means that they're outside the jurisdiction of the FDA. Now, one reason that Scientology is so controversial is that the Scientology auditing levels become really, really expensive. So this image here is called the Bridge to Total Freedom, which is sort of a map of the spiritual path from start to finish. This level here is called clear, where you essentially clear the negative experiences from this particular lifetime. And just to get to that level would cost a minimum of about $128,000. These upper levels are called operating Phaeton, which means your spiritual self or Phaeton is increasingly free of the limits of the material world. And these become quite expensive. To get to the highest level that's been released so far, OT8 would cost between $350,000 and $400,000. So it might be more than that, so sometimes that's repeat levels. Now, this leads us to the question of Scientology and the IRS. And this is what Scientology called the war, its battle with the IRS. This begins in 1956 and 1957, when initially the Washington, D.C. and California churches of Scientology were granted tax exemption, which is not that hard to get. But then in 1958, the IRS began to scrutinize their finances and determined that most of the money was going to L. Ron Hubbard's personal life and family. And so they stripped the D.C. church's exemption in 1958. They then transferred all Scientology assets to the California church, which was still tax exempt. But then the IRS did a massive audit of Scientology in 1963, and revoked the California church's exemption and all Scientology churches' exemption, which led to what Scientology called the war for 26 years, a massive series of lawsuits between Scientology and the IRS that at one point they had 2,000 lawsuits going simultaneously. So it was a gigantic, hugely complicated and expensive battle for the IRS. In the middle of all this, Scientology began to undertake some covert operations. This is where the story gets kind of bizarre. So Scientology had its own intelligence office called the Guardian's Office, which actually infiltrated IRS offices in Washington, D.C. They stole thousands of documents from the IRS. They bugged IRS offices while they were discussing Scientology. When the FBI figured out what was going on, they launched the largest raid in the FBI's history, and they raided the Scientology offices in Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles. Mary Sue Hubbard, Hubbard's wife, who was the head of the operation, was arrested along with many others, and Hubbard went into hiding for the rest of his life. And in the middle of all this, the IRS actually began to revise its own guidelines for thinking about what is religion. And in the handout that I sent you around, you can see that in 1977, they issued a new series of 13 points to help guide how to determine what is and is not a religious organization. You can read those to yourself. And if you look at the bottom of that document, just for a second, you can see that the IRS commissioner himself said this was in part because they were getting so much criticism for the way in which they were dealing with new religions and new churches, and I think he meant specifically Scientology. So in other words, the battle between Scientology and the IRS forced the IRS to rethink how it itself defined religion. Now in 1993, this was resolved when the head of Scientology at the time, David Miscavige, met privately with the IRS commissioner, and they reached a private settlement, the details of which have never been fully disclosed. But it involved a $12.5 million settlement in which Scientology gave a flat fee to the IRS, and in turn the IRS gave Scientology blanket exemption, not just for its churches and religious entities, but for all Scientology-related organizations, including secular entities such as Galaxy Press, which publishes Hubbard's science fiction, which has nothing to do with religion, is also now tax exempt. So it was a pretty remarkable decision. At the same time, in 1993, the US State Department also began to include Scientology in its annual report on religious freedom, in which they talk about religious freedom around the world. And they not only defend Scientology now, but they also criticize other governments, such as Germany, which has been much more harsh on Scientology. And the key point is that although Scientology is now recognized as religion by the IRS and the State Department of the United States, it's viewed very differently in many other nations. Chancellor Helmut Kohl in Germany called Scientology one point a cultish psycho group, comparing it to various forms of authoritarianism. In France, Scientologists were convicted of fraud, and it's classified in the French system as a sect, which is basically the word for a cult. And if you look around the world, its status varies pretty dramatically. This is just a little breakdown of where Scientology is and is not recognized as a religion around the world. So it is in Croatia and the Czech Republic, but not in Denmark or in Austria, Belgium, and many others. So its status varies pretty widely from one part of the world to the next. Now, I wanted to just throw out some questions that I thought we could discuss as a panel and as a group after the presentations. The first one is one everyone wants to ask, which is the is it really a religion question. I don't think this is the most interesting question, but we can talk about it. You might think that it's more like a cult of greed, as Time magazine called it. You might think it's a for-profit business. The questions that I'm more interested in, that I talk about in my book, is first, what is at stake in calling something a religion? Why does it matter? Who cares? And secondly, maybe most importantly, who decides? Is it scholars who decide is it religion? Is it the courts? Is it the IRS? Is it the State Department? Is it the media? Is it the religious leaders themselves? I have my own answers to these questions when I think about it, but I think I'll just stop there and let our next speaker go on, and then maybe we can return to these questions at the end. Okay, so thank you for your attention.
Hello. Hello. Now does it work? Oh, beautiful. Awesome, thank you. So here's what I want to talk about. I'm going to cover 3 different groups. I'll give you sort of an outline and a breakdown after the next slide. But I'm interested in religious individuals and religious communities that claim as religious ideas and as religious practice, the work of law, the performance of law. This guy here, I'm not going to say a lot about him. He protests against paying taxes. He dresses up as George Washington. He embodies a certain kind of sacred mythological narrative about the founders and a certain approach to American citizenship and identity as a continuation of the revolution that I think is useful for an image to put on a first slide, because there's a way in which this immediately looks kind of like religious stuff. And that indeed is what I'm going after. So when I look at religion, law as religion, I'm not interested in religious law, in dietary laws, and Sharia, and canon law, and those sorts of things. I'm interested in the idea of, quote-unquote, those are scare quotes as well, secular law being imagined and practiced as religion. Public protest as an expression of legal rights, of citizenship, encounters with police as display of knowledge of law, and courtroom trials as places to demonstrate and experience a notion of sovereignty that is underwritten by law. So these are the 3 things I'm going to fairly swiftly move through: protests, encounters with police, and trials, and those are the themes that I'll talk about there. Some of you might know this fellow. His name is Jon Ritzheimer. This is sort of his moment of fame. Before this moment, he ran something called the Yell at a Mosque campaign that I think is rather self-explanatory in terms of what it was about. He's hence changed his opinion on Islam slightly because he realizes the federal government is a little bit anti-Islamic, and the enemy of his enemy is something like his friend. This is him at the end of December 2015. He is on his way to join the Bundy brothers, Ammon Bundy and his brother, who are calling themselves the Citizens for Constitutional Freedom. And they're about to begin several weeks of armed occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon. And Ritzheimer records this tearful farewell that he posts on YouTube. YouTube, very important to the religious communities that I'm going to talk about today. This tearful farewell where he holds up his camera that has a picture of his wife and his two daughters. And he holds up this particular copy of the Constitution, and he says this is not what he would like to do. He would like to spend Christmas with his kids. He'd like to see his family again. He suspects he is going to die, and he suspects he is going to die because he took an oath on the Constitution, and he has a responsibility as an American citizen to fulfilling a certain notion of America. One that he believes the federal government is in conflict with. I want to start with this because here we also see an important aspect of material culture in relation to the law. Those of you who were in the class this morning heard me talk about how legal texts can become objects. This is a prime example, right? The Constitution as something that is carried around, something that is gestured with, not necessarily something that is read, right? It's understood by these communities as not really needing to be read in order to understand its meaning. This has a deep, deep history in American Protestantism. If I'd had more than 15 minutes, I would have read a bit from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, where Huck Finn attends a Campbellite revival, and the Bible is passed around, and the preacher says, "This is the brazen serpent. Look upon it and be healed." He doesn't say, take it and read it and exegete it. The text becomes a sacred object. Now, this particular text is even more of a sacred object because of the pocket constitutions available, and I can recommend 7 with very distinct ideological lenses. This is one called the Skousen Constitution, put together by a political thinker and Mormon thinker, who has a particular agenda in presenting the Constitution as sacred. What does that look like on the immediate level for us? We see here on the cover, not every Constitution has George Washington on the cover. This one has George Washington, and he's actually reaching out toward you, handing you a quill pen. That quill pen is useful for the line on the back where you, as owner of this Constitution, are to take a personal oath. The oath reads, "I, as one of we the people of the United States, affirm that I have read or will read our U.S. Constitution and pledge to maintain and promote its standard of liberty for myself and my posterity, and do hereby attest to that by my signature." Under the line for your signature is a line for witness. That witness signature has already been filled in with George Washington's signature, right? So this idea of participating in sacred history made really, I think, visible and apparent there. I also want to point out one more thing before I move to the next image. The language here, promote its standard of liberty. Those of you who know LDS, who know Latter-day Saints tradition, standard of liberty has a very specific meaning in that sacred history. It's the flag that Captain Moroni, son of Mormon, important guy who later goes on to help Joseph Smith find and translate the plates. It's the flag that he makes to represent God's God-given freedom here on earth, particularly in the project that becomes America. So, public protest, rife with, thick with stuff that looks like religion, that functions as religious. This is another shot from the protest at Malheur. And one of the ways that this looks like religion, that this functions like religion, is an eschatology, a notion of history in which American citizens have to play a defining and important role in preserving and or bringing about a restored version of America. This is a guy who got famous at the occupation, calls himself Captain Moroni, blowing the shofar again, doing some stuff that looks religious. Encounters with police might look less religious, but this is central to the sort of work that I'm working on now in a manuscript I'm completing, where various American religious communities take it as a central religious claim. Dr. Urban mentioned Moorish Science Temple of America. This is one of the more famous ones. Take it as a central religious claim that to know one's true identity, to be something in Moorish science language, something other than a Negro, which is a legal category, right, and an oppressed legal category. To be other than that is likewise to have an identity that has legal consequences. This is the first step in a series of claims about legal knowledge as indeed sacred knowledge. Now, what good does it do to have knowledge of God's true law if you don't, in fact, somehow preach that truth to power in the world, particularly to those forms of power that act on behalf of the law enforcement? So here's a guy, and I include these images just because most of these, and I would urge you to go to YouTube and look these up, most of these encounters with police, you can look up, say, sovereign citizen videos, most of these encounters with police are largely audio because you've got a phone and you're in your car and police is at your window. This guy has a python on the street, so it's a little bit more pleasant to look at in videos. Part of what's at play, this is a group of Moorish scientists here, part of what's at play in the tension that I'm examining and in the cases that I'm offering rather quickly to you today is a necessity of rethinking secularism. Secularism not as some sort of wall of separation, the secular not as a state of irreligiosity or lacking religiosity, but secularism as indeed an approach to a way to frame and a way to police religion. Going back again to Dr. Urban's question of what counts as religion, right? This, I think, is a central legal and political question. This is the question that is at the core of secularism. And some of these, if you want to call them new religious movements or minority religious movements, marginalized religious movements, are in an awkward situation in that their religion looks like something else. So much of the anti-Scientology criticism says, well, Scientology is a business enterprise that masks itself as religion. So much of the anti-Moorish Science Temple criticism says this is a civic organization, this is a political group that's presenting itself somehow as religion. And we all know as Americans that religion as a legal category comes with certain privileges. So I think there's a suspicion about these claims that does not help us move forward as people who are trying to think about either how religion works or how law works. This is a great video I'd recommend you look up called Moors in Court Got the Judge Shook. One reason that I'm including these images of YouTube videos is because I'm interested not just in the event that happens, but I'm interested in the after effect of that event, and particularly the communities that form in interpretation of the online videos. Did that make sense as a sentence? I think most of y'all have grown up in a world where things are online and y'all can talk about them. That's actually pretty revolutionary, and it's really making a difference in terms of some of these new religious movements. So you could, in fact, watch the footage from this particular court and not think that the judge, as the author there says, got shook. Right? There's already some interpretation going on in terms of what is happening. This is an example of courtroom performance. Here's another one that's, again, maybe a little bit more colorful for the purposes of a PowerPoint slideshow. This is a man who calls himself Montana's Natural Man. He is embodying vernacular interpretation of certain legal terms. The law says a corporation can be a person. The natural man responds and says, I'm not that kind of person. I'm not a legal fiction. And in order to prove I'm not a legal fiction, again, I will embody my true legal status. I'm going to look like a mountain man. I'm going to live like a mountain man. I'm going to talk in terms of basic American rights and values as reflected in law. Now, what does he do most of the time when he's not in court, offering a defense of his actions? He's out poaching and breaking game laws, for which he then routinely gets arrested and comes to court. I wanted to give you a close-up of the sign to give you some sense of again, this sort of vernacular language, vernacular reading of legal language. Now, there are consequences to this. The natural man routinely, in his courtroom displays of vernacular legal knowledge, fails to the extent that he gets locked up in jail. There's some rather dramatic videos where he also just runs to the parking lot and drives away very quickly. I think any of us who've thought seriously about religion know that there are times when you can supposedly lose or fail, and that's in fact read as a victory, particularly for religious communities that are embedded in a worldview where the state's interpretation of the legal is necessarily corrupt, and the system of the state is necessarily corrupt and oppressive. Sarah Berenger Gordon, in her book about religion and law, talks about how sometimes in the history of, say, Jehovah's Witness litigation, to lose is to win, right? To be punished as opposed to be accorded rights is a way of knowing, yes, the state is corrupt and you were part of the righteous remnant. That, I think, is an important dynamic for those of us thinking about law to consider. There's also an afterlife to these events, as we see here in YouTube. And now I'll move to my final slide. The consequences for us. Look, I wanted to speak fairly quickly here about not just religion and law as different systems of authority, making different claims about the world and meaning and what one should do in that world, but religion and quote-unquote secular law as, in fact, subject to the same claims, right? That the courthouse that we might think of as supposedly secular is a site on which various religious communities are also investing their own desires and their own interpretations. So conflicting claims to the same authority. I don't think this is merely an American phenomenon. I'd love to talk a little bit about that in questions. I'm now at my 15 minutes. The final thing I'll say is, I think this also should urge us to rethink questions about politics and political participation and protest. I think some of the most interesting questions about contemporary religion today are about, for instance, religion's intersections and entanglements in the Black Lives Matter movement. I think there's religion often in places where we might not expect to see it, or where legally it's simply not handy for us to see it. It's inconvenient for us to see it. So thank you.
Wow, thank you both for these great presentations. I do want to take up the very first question that you brought up, Professor Urban, is it a religion? What is religion? Can we get that squared away? So yeah, exactly, yeah. To get everyone on board.
I actually am interested in what the audience thinks.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I think it's a trap. Right, and on the one hand, I think this might be sort of a cheap answer from a professional religionist. Perhaps I should have a more robust theory, but one of the reasons I'm so interested in intersections of religion and law is that here's a venue, American law, international law, where claims to religion have consequences and have matters, right? So we've got colleagues in religious studies who are interested in, is NFL fandom a kind of religion? Those are not uninteresting questions, but man, also a really, really slippery slope. So I take some comfort in the fact that I study folks who make explicit claims to religion, so I think I should take those seriously. And I study legal debates about whether something counts or not. Again, that's kind of cheap, that's kind of passing the buck, but man, I wouldn't want to go down that other route.
Well, let me give my answer and then maybe give others. I think there's two separate ways of answering it. One is it a religion in the eyes of government agencies and the law? And the answer to that is Scientology is a religion in the United States in the eyes of the IRS and the State Department, but it is not a religion in France and other countries. That's one way of answering it, simply from the standpoint of how government entities view those groups. The other question is whether I personally think Scientology is a religion. And my answer to that would be that I think the First Amendment is an incredibly important pillar of our democratic system, and therefore I think it's usually a good idea to err on the side of giving groups the benefit of the doubt, giving them the doubt rather than saying, so that would be my answer to it.
So does anyone in the audience have any ideas, thoughts, recommendations? Yes.
I think like what Professor Urban talked about like in the beginning, like about like the questions that you ask, like why it could be a religion. Like I think for me personally, like I want to know like how we were created. I want to know all the origins of the universe and everything. So if a certain religion doesn't answer that, then for me, I probably wouldn't consider it a religion. So I think it's based off of the kind of questions that you have, that you're wondering.
Okay.
But does a religion have to answer those questions to be a religion? For example, Buddhism doesn't answer one of those questions.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in my eyes, I would say it would need to answer those questions because, you know, that's my definition of religion, but I think everybody has totally different definitions that you're never going to come to one solid.
Yeah, the interesting thing about Scientology is it does have elaborate cosmological stories, but they're revealed for the most part in the upper levels of operating Thetan levels. The most famous one is revealed at level operating Thetan 3, which is the story that was mocked on an episode of South Park about Scientology, which is this extremely elaborate story about an intergalactic Emperor Xenu who lived 75 million years ago, and it's an extremely complicated story. But one reason that's often seen as controversial is that Scientologists don't, at least before the internet, didn't have access to that story until they're at that higher level of training after they've already invested many years and lots of dollars into that church. So some have seen it as problematic that you don't even get access to some of the key cosmological portions of the belief system until you're well into this technology. But it does have those kinds of narratives about where we come from and why there is misery.
Yeah, and like, I mean, you also said, like, you got to kind of divide into two different questions. If the government sees it as a religion, I think that, like, you're right, like, I might think, like, one thing, but I think it's better to just give the benefit of the doubt that, you know, you can't just tell someone it's not a religion, that it's not.
Right. I mean, I think there's a separate question of whether it should be tax exempt. I think you can also separate those two issues, whether it should be recognized as a religion versus whether it's making money in a for-profit sense, is therefore not tax exempt.
Yes.
Yeah, so one thing, and one stuff, I think when a lot of time we're discussing religion, just like from my perspective and what I've experienced growing up, and I hear people discuss religion here around me, it seems like such a foreign and Western concept in the sense of it's not philosophical. And for me, like, first of all, religion being a Western construction makes me like, when in our own scholarship, are we going about this the right way? Because we all acknowledge it's a Western concept, but still we discuss, let's say, whatever Hinduism, Buddhism, these words, like, these isms that have been going to the same place. So there's like such a hegemony, such a culture of even white supremacy and colonialism legacy. And as a student and like aspiring scholar, I wonder always how we're going to supersede that. And to me personally, to Muslim women across the world, there's so many different ways as women in different intersectional identities where when there's such a hegemonic white male Christian perspective, it's so difficult to go past that. But a question that I was wondering is, just like throughout the beginning of how religion with regard to how it came about in law and all that seems very surrounded by material culture and just tax exemptions, right? And how like financially things will play out and how that's kind of central to maybe like Western, maybe American culture largely. There's like a lot of, I think, scholarship on materialistic culture, Christianity related. But is there a way to discuss this? Like, is it smart to even look at this beyond materialism? Are we doing justice to it when we're trying to like discuss things outside that when that seems so central to it? Like, should we even be discussing what is religion, etc., more so than is this like politically safe for people in the sense of are we protecting people or are we just allowing continued like Christian hegemony and all of that? Like, just can we separate this from materialism when discussing it? And why is it okay to do that?
Okay. Wow.
Two
different, yeah.
Can I tackle the first half and give you the second half? Yes. So, how do I do this? Can you hear me? Yes, it's a problematic concept, right? It's a concept with specific imperial, which is to say racial, hegemonic, oppressive stuff to it. Again, a cheap answer would be that's one reason to say stick to an American context where there's some background and framing there. I am suspicious, and this is something that came up in the Scientology presentation when we talk about religion as an international legal category. There's some slippage, right? So on that chart, the way Denmark talks about is it right? I mean, right? Like Danish law means can you perform a marriage that's recognized by the state? It doesn't mean it's not recognized as a religion. So there's some necessarily stuff gets lost in translation. That doesn't address the larger and I think urgent political critique that you're making. And I'm not sure what to do about that other than to make it, and to make it not just about the history of religion and the history of scholarship on religion, which are too unpleasantly untangled as male white imperial ventures, but also to make it about law, right? So that if we see that, for instance, American law is enshrining categories that have the same sort of oppressive provenance, that's something to fight against. Did that kind of seem like an answer?
Not a new one, but yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say one more thing quickly, which is, I find myself in a complicated situation. One, I'm that white hegemonic guy, and you know, at the moment I'm working with African American folk who are, and I didn't quite make this clear in this morning's class, among other things, really seizing and reiterating systems of racism and oppression. Right? This thing about you are not a Negro, you are a Moor, for a lot of Moorish scientists, that thing called a Negro is real and it's in the world and they do not deserve the right to vote, right? So there's an anti-black racism that's enshrined in this, as you say, material attempt to try and survive in a racist world. I don't know, that deserves some attention too. Do I have a solution? No. Sorry.
Yeah, that one thing is like, yeah, you were talking today about how they blame themselves for slavery.
Right.
And that, I think that is definitely oppression in a deeper form, and they should not be blamed for it themselves. Like, I think that's very unfair.
Could I pick up on what you just said and then add something to the second answer? So I think you're 100% right that our category of religion is largely a European and American construction. It has a relatively recent history. It's not really used in the sense we use it today, prior to about 500 years ago. And you're right that in many other cultures, like India, where you're from, there isn't really a category that maps on exactly what we need. So there's dharma, which means sort of religion, also means duty and social order. But that being said, because of the way ideas circulate and the way that global power circulates, religion has now been internalized by many other cultures, including India, which now also categorizes Hindus versus Muslims versus Jains versus Sikhs, etc. So it's true that it's a European-American construction, but it's now become dominant in many parts of the world. Then the other point you raised is about whether our definition of religion is sort of too materialistic and emphasizes
It's not materialistic ever. they're trying to go outside of materialism, and I feel like that's so central to the problems regarding religion.
Right. That's particularly true in the United States because of the complex history of the First Amendment and the way that different courts have interpreted it. The courts have generally had a fairly hands-off view of religion and tended not to define religion because that would be interfering with the right to free exercise. But we do have tax exemption for religion, so ironically that has meant that determinations about what is religion or not has fallen to the IRS by default because there are other entities that are default. So ironically, in cases like Scientology, it sort of has been the IRS's decision rather than crediting us.
I think it is no longer wait for the government to interpret it other than this because these are the times where cases come up with regard to this today. So I've seen around
I mean they tend to come on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes the Supreme Court has made decisions. There was a group called the Neo-American Church in the 1960s that claimed that their sacrament was LSD, and the court in that case said, no, you're not a real religion here, so they're still, but often it's been the IRS.
So let's get back to that question of law and government, because Spencer, you brought up the slide versus we the people, and I'm questioning of who is we. Does that include all American persons, including women and queer identified persons? Or what do you mean by citizens? Who are the citizens? Those who are newly citizens of the U.S. as well? That's one question. The second question is around Scientology and race. For those of y'all who don't know, the largest Scientology center is located in Harlem, which is a primarily black community. So a lot of people like to make those faces like, wow, would they build a primarily large Scientology center in Harlem? But they also have Scientology centers in Detroit as well. They bought up a lot of property in Detroit as well, in downtown Detroit, and other urban centers, Compton as well. So Scientology is infiltrating into black communities. If we're talking about Scientology as law and government, then how does that imply to people of color? That's the second question. The third is regarding finances, because Scientology is very expensive because in order to go through these clearing processes, you have to pay a fee every time you go for your clearing. So how does that prove accessible for those who are economically disadvantaged? Yes. Queer.
That's a complicated.
Women and yes. Yeah, you gotta tap it.
Can you hear me now? Oh yeah. Wow, so Americans say that they're part of this thing called we the people. Americans say that as individuals and as a constituency they are sovereign. That is some pretty complicated / crazy stuff. How does it work out? Really, really poorly. So my immediate answer to your question is, I'm interested in we the people and citizen as religious categories, right? As categories that individuals and communities theorize and embody and articulate. So Noble Drew Ali, probably the best example, founder of Moorish Science Temple of America, he says citizenship is salvation. Right? Citizenship means you are no longer considered a Negro, you are no longer either a chattel slave or a mental slave or a political slave. And citizenship is then two things. One, it's recognized status. The state recognizes that you are a full human being, equal to others. Again, we're in a realm of, let's say, democratic myth, but it's a myth I think we would like to instantiate. The second thing that citizenship means in Ali's thought and for Moorish science is citizenship is a process, right? It's a set of responsibilities, what he calls sacred duties. As a citizen, you have to do stuff. For some folks, that's litigate. For most folks, that's vote, register others to vote. You have to engage in the democratic process. And the goal there is to instantiate an ideal America where the lion and the lamb lay down together and everyone has equal access to justice. Notably, in Ali's utopia, people don't have equal access to resources. He talks about, in the future, the rich and the poor will just get along. There's still going to be rich folk, there's still going to be poor folk. And I think, to go back to the question about material, I think some of that's kind of a material compromise, right? He doesn't want to he thinks it might be too risky to envision a utopia where everybody shares everything alike. But a utopia where we can be respected as human beings and get a fair shake in front of the court, that's a pretty utopian utopia. So I don't know, that's sort of half an answer to your question. Yeah, who's we the people? Always really problematic. We also, very often in religious communities, implies a they. Right? If we're us, they're them. And we need to police those lines and define those lines.
Yes.
So you asked two questions about Scientology, one about race and one about finances.
Yes.
So the race question is really interesting. First, I'd say that the worldview of Scientology is, I wouldn't say progressive, but the Thetan, the spiritual self, has neither race nor gender. So Hubbard talks about past lives, and you could be reborn as anything. He talks about past lives where you're on other planets. You could be any gender. You could be an alien on another planet. So from a sort of metaphysical, spiritual perspective, race doesn't matter. You mentioned the large centers in Harlem and Detroit. I think that's part of an initiative that Scientology started maybe in the 90s or so to reach out to African Americans because there was relatively few in Scientology. You probably remember the 92 degree of success. I think it was part of an attempt to bring in non-white people to the church. Then it's about finances, which is a really good question. So you're right that for the most part, to go through the auditing levels, especially the more advanced ones, operating levels, requires a lot of money. There are some ways around that. First of all, you don't have to go through auditing to be involved with Scientology. You can go to a Scientology church where they usually have Sunday services. There's one in Cincinnati for free. You can also join the Sea organization, which is the elite sort of paramilitary part of the hardcore Scientologists who wear naval uniforms. And if you're in the Sea Org, you're automatically. But that being said, they definitely do draw a lot of their war chest from wealthy people and celebrities, keeping it financially.
Okay. So I want to bring up, since we talked about it briefly, we touched on it around the religiosity of football. And in this political climate, how religion plays a huge part in who's kneeling, who's standing for the anthem. Was it really, what's at stake for religion and the anthem, or the symbolism of American citizenship? What is at stake for the government? What is at stake for football?
Run that last bit by one more time.
What is at stake for the government?
In people kneeling?
Or standing?
Wow.
There's a lot at stake.
This is
There's a lot at stake, religiously.
Expected.
And the symbolism around the flag, because there is a religiosity around the
well, so as I understand it,
if we consider that as a religion.
Wait, where does the religion fit in? So as I understand it, there are some professional football players who are protesting issues of systematic racism,
Right.
police brutality, by kneeling during the national anthem. This has been reframed, not just by the government, also by some law enforcement advocacy organizations, as an assault on veterans, our sacralized dead, and our living law enforcement. That's both farcical and how empire works. So that's really unpleasant. Where does the religion fit in? Are people kneeling also for religious reasons? Could be, but I don't know about it.
What's the Baltimore?
I mean, if the question is what's at stake calling America's obsession with sports religion or the world's obsession with soccer religion, I don't know, I share that question. I mean, I think what some of my colleagues in religion and sports, which is kind of a sub-discipline, I think what they would say is we're able to learn something about human nature by sort of using theoretical lenses of religion to look at, I don't know, Buenos Aires soccer riots. But it's a bit outside my...
Well, I bring that because the former Baltimore Ravens player said, who kneeled on both knees instead of one knee, said he kneeled on both knees because he was praying for are going there. So that was because he said he would never kneel. But then when he was on the field and he was kneeling on both knees, he said his response was, I was praying.
I think in that case, the invocation of religion lends a kind of specialness and, in some cases, special status and protection to things that might not otherwise have. So by calling it praying, right, saying this isn't just an ordinary act of protest, this is something that's sacred and special. And when others criticize the act of kneeling for saying this violates our core American principles, our sacred values, they're giving our Americanness, our nationality, our specialness, in which not paying proper homage to that is a special act.
Did you have other comments? Questions from the floor? Dr. Drake?
I didn't have a question. I just wanted to kind of go further with this idea of, with the NFL and with the kneeling and religion, because, well, many things that are connected to our sense of patriotism also have religion, right, or particularly Christianity, Protestantism embedded within it, right? I mean, one nation under God, and so I think there is that connection that can't be disassociated from it, even if people aren't being explicit about the relationship.
No, I think that's right. I think that's why the kneeling is so offensive to many people who do regard American values or the idea of the nation as sacred in some sense. That it's seen as an act of blasphemy in a sense.
And simultaneously as, I mean, I think this is part of the, I don't know if schizophrenia is the right word, but there's sort of a double valence in terms of American consciousness, maybe you want to say sacral consciousness, where on the one hand, sure, they're symbols and they matter and we respect them. The Supreme Court says the flag of the United States is technically a body, which is odd, but interesting. Yet at the same time, America has this deep-rooted Protestant anti-iconography impulse to it as well, right? And this sense that the symbol, that there's something blasphemous to the symbol standing in for the thing. So in terms of religious rhetoric around these protests, I can imagine equally vehement, authentic, sincere, and quite moving rhetoric on either side, right? I mean, I used to teach Chicago Police Department officers. I've got friends who are cops, none of whom seem unupset by this act of kneeling, which they take to be a real affront. I understand where they're coming from. I think they're being misled in their interpretation. But I also certainly understand why folks who are protesting in this way are phrasing it in terms of deep respect for the idea of the nation and the idea of the nation that is being blasphemed in lived reality. Did that make sense? It's a little rough there at the edge.
To me?
Yeah, I guess.
Okay, sure. But I would add, as someone whose husband is a police officer,
Yeah.
who's quite irritated about the backlash against the protesting. So all officers are not finding it to be, registering it as an affront. Some actually are recognizing what the players intend for it to represent.
Because to others, the right or the ability to protest is as sacred a value as.
Yes.
Can you talk about the sort of the moment of transformation? You specifically talked about when at first it was just sort of like a self-help thing, and then it really, I mean, there's pragmatic and potentially spiritual justifications for it sort of transforming into this religious thing.
Right.
And it seems like you can think similarly with these other new religions, like not necessarily in terms of sort of the outputs of the Dianetics, but just sort of ritualistic experiences or experiences of empowerment or experiences that seem like spiritual and seem like they have this sort of religious, I mean, how, so just talking about, I can imagine that shift, but it seems like a very strange, I mean, it's like the new religions shift, right? Like usually when we think about religions, we don't think of them as coming about, like we think of them as having been around.
Right.
So I mean, just sort of thinking through this.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's one reason so many people have a problem with Scientology, because you can track in real time when it was not a religion and then when it presents itself as a religion. And L. Ron Hubbard, in his early writings, up to the early 1950s, was actually quite critical of mainstream religion, and especially of Christianity. And the shift in the religion direction, as I said, I think happened for both kind of spiritual reasons and for very practical reasons. I think part of it was the belief that members were experiencing past life memories in the course of odyssey, which led to develop the idea of a faith in our spiritual self. And a lot of it was practical to get the FDA off their back. And you can see this in a letter that Hubbard wrote in, I think, 1952, in which he talks about pursuing what he called the religion angle. And he basically says that we're going bankrupt, we're losing money, what we're doing isn't working, maybe we should pursue the religion angle. And it seems pretty clear that he meant pursuing it for very practical reasons. I mean, it says in various documents from the 1950s and 60s that this is mainly a legal matter. It doesn't really change what we were doing all along. So it seems that there was a very pragmatic and rational, in addition to kind of some of the changes.
So just as a follow-up, I mean, does that matter? Does it matter that people, that the shift happens for pragmatic reasons? Like if we could tell if that's the most convincing causal story?
Matter to who? To practitioners?
I mean, I guess it's to the what is religion, why do we care about it?
Yeah, interestingly, many members of the early Dianetics movement were not happy about that. They didn't like religion, they didn't want to be religion, and so there were some folks, and Hubbard actually interacted with them and went back and forth with them, who thought this was a really bad idea. That they got into this because they wanted to improve their lives and their memories and be more successful in business. They didn't get into it for religious reasons. And he tried to reassure them that no, you can keep doing what you've always been doing. So members of the community weren't always happy about it. You're asking whether it matters about whether we think it's a religion or not. I guess in the end, I would say ultimately no, because if people are practicing it now and take it seriously as a religion, I don't think we can say that it's not religious to them.
So we know that Scientology is very celebrity-driven. From Tom Cruise, John Travolta. For those of you who may not know, Shaka Khan is also a Scientologist. Dougie Fresh is also a Scientologist. Brandy, the singer, is also a Scientologist. Have there been any outreach to politicians who, why is such a thing to be an acknowledged celebrity of Scientology, more so than other religions, and then also why not politicians? And does Scientology contribute to any Democratic or Republican Party or any other party financially?
That's a really interesting question. But this pursuit of celebrities started in the mid-1950s. They had a Project Celebrity in which they explicitly set out to target celebrities to become basically spokespersons or representatives of Scientology. And in the early documents, they talk about going after everyone from, they talk about going after Billy Graham, so it was an explicit self-conscious initiative to try to bring celebrities in, and then they started building celebrity centers in California and around the world, where they cater to celebrities and treat them well, and celebrities also sort of fast-track through their life. And I think it's partly the money, it's partly that it brings higher profile and more prominence to the movement. But on the flip side, many celebrities, I think, are drawn to it in part because one of the things that Scientology promises is to unleash your full potential, as not just as a person, but as a spiritual being, including your full creativity. So I think the promise is there that you'll be a better actor, and Scientology said that you create new reality as well as actors. So I think the promise of unleashing your creativity.
And then politicians?
Oh, politicians. maybe you know more than I do, but for the most part, Scientology has been fairly politically disengaged. Yeah, that's right. So when the State Department made the decision to include Scientology in the annual religious freedom, and they were trying to get recognition in Germany, Travolta and a few others lobbied the administration to put pressure on Germany to recognize that. Other than that, they've been pretty.
So, Professor, you said something about the context of law interpretation for the First Amendment protections. You said something indicating you separate that from the tax status.
I think you can, and actually, in the history of Scientology's war with the IRS, when the IRS initially stripped their tax exemption, they basically said, it doesn't matter whether you're religion or not, you're making money and it's going to the personal, it's going to L. Ron Hubbard's personal pockets and his family. So their initial argument was, religion doesn't really matter here, you're a for-profit business. And it was Scientology who pushed the religion card, and so you saw the slide that I had, the guy with the clerical collar and the cross. They started really presenting themselves as a religion by displaying the cross, probably with the Scientology creed was displayed publicly in their buildings. So it was Scientology that really used the heavy rhetoric of religion, and that was their claim that they should be taxed. Whereas the IRS's initial position was it doesn't matter. So I think maybe Isaac knows a lot more about law than I do. I think you can probably separate those two, although historically they've often been.
So what I'm interested in is what the rationality is for this exemption. I mean, whether or not it matters whether religion depends a bit on why there's a tax exemption on religion in the first place. And I know many religious organizations are engaged in charitable work, all of them agree. So I guess I had thought on this, what I had thought it was because you wanted to protect religion from government control, the power of tax, the power of control. So, and then I guess it looks to me like it might be happening with their religion, whether they want it or not, the religion has some special protection.
Well, I'm not an expert on the history of tax-exempt law, but you can read Bruce Hopkinson's the law of tax-exempt exemptions. I mean, my understanding is that exemptions for religious organizations predate the Constitution. They're there in the colonies, and different colonies gave different exemptions to different groups. The Catholic colonies gave Catholic groups exemptions, and then after the formation of the United States, states began to spread those exemptions to all religious entities. And then federal law on tax exemption, I think, starts in the 1890s and continues to be revised up through the 60s and 70s. So it evolved over a very long period of time. But the basic idea is that these are groups that are engaged in charitable activities and are not for profit. And then with the Johnson Amendment, also not engaged in political activities. So maybe one reason I mean, that's my understanding of the brief history of the rationale. But we can think of lots of examples of religious figures and groups that make quite a lot of money. Joel Osteen, for example, or Pat Robertson, or Partridge, or Ron Park's figure in Columbus, who make actually far more money than Scientology does. And most of these groups have not had any problem with tax exemption. So in some ways, it's a little bit hypocritical to pick on Scientology when there are lots of other religious figures who have been benefiting from tax exemption.
It might well be sort of a fishy category of law, but I find it unlikely to think we'll get it rolled back, if that makes sense. It's unlikely Creflo Dollar will lose his tax exemption.
Right. Yes.
One of the ways the point you're making about how religion essentially for economic disparity is to what demographics are they targeting? Like, are they targeting specifically adults, older people? Are they targeting children? Because as someone who's interested in education policy, I find that significant. And thinking about it that way is how if in fact they are targeting children, or through parents targeting children. How do you, in my mind, protect those children from such ideologies?
You're talking about Scientology specifically? Yeah. I think Scientology's demographics have changed a lot over time. The early movement was largely white and largely middle class, and then it starts bringing in wealthier people and celebrities. I think that the turn toward building centers in urban areas is an attempt to make the demographic less white and to bring in African-American. As far as children, they do have a school reading program, among other things that I think is designed to help children read, but also to some degree. Yeah. But I think most of the children who are in Scientology are the children of existing Scientologists.
It's interesting because Dougie Fresh and Shaka Khan does talk highly about that literacy program, and it is a huge part of the schools in Harlem as well as in Detroit. They implemented this literacy program. Also, one of the other programs is the drug treatment centers in those communities, because drugs have infiltrated those minority communities. And Scientology believes in this, you can, without using methadone or any other type of drug treatment, you can do it by over the will of the mind of overcoming your drug addiction. So that's one of the other reasons why they infiltrated those communities. Yeah, but for some, they believe that it actually does work. Like, I don't need drugs to help alter my mind or alter my ability to think out of this situation. I can do it on my own, the will of my own mind, which is what our program was talking about.
Yeah, the actress Kirstie Alley claims that Scientology helped her overcome her drug and alcohol addiction solely through single course.
Which is why Tom Cruise received flack around his comment on Cindy Brooke Shields when she took postpartum depression medication, and he said that Scientology knows this. That means that you're weak, and so he received a lot of flack for that comment around that statement. Anyone else? Yes.
Are there any practicing Scientologists in the prisons?
That's a good question. I haven't really done any research on that specifically myself, but Scientology does have a program called Crimenon, and it's similar to their drug and alcohol program, Narconon, which is for people with drug and alcohol use problems. Crimenon is intended to help rehabilitate convicts and reintegrate them into society. I don't know if they do that within prisons or whether it's solely outside the prison. I'm sorry, I don't have a...
One more question. What makes people want to have a religion?
That's a good question. Anybody? Melissa would make someone want to have a religion.
Said, what do you mean by religion?
I mean, honestly, I think for some people it's as simple as community and very, very sort of basic, something like friendship, right? I mean, it's about humans coming together. That's certainly only one angle. There are folks who have deep philosophical, intellectual questions, but I mean, when I think of sort of lived Moorish science community, a lot of it's around the banquet table as much as it is around the sacred text.
I think if you're talking about specifically with like Scientology, the folks that I've talked to they came to Scientology for all sorts of different reasons. So in the 1960s, many people were interested in reincarnation and Eastern religions. So a number of people I talked to thought that was really cool that Scientology had this belief in reincarnation. Others were interested in more practical things like they have a communication course which helps you become a better communicator, and that was what drew them in. Or for some it was that Scientology promises to raise your IQ or your literacy and your vocabulary. Right? So I think with any new religion, people become become involved for the same reasons they become involved in any other religion, which could be about community, it could be about personal life, it could be about larger spiritual and physical questions, like where do we come from? There's no single answer.
Yeah. And final question for the evening. Make it deep.
I feel like above all else, as far as being religion, from what I see that the basic human fear of death and need to, have some kind of confirmation that there's something after death and understanding that. I feel like that's a very big part of needing a religion. And then all those other things play into it. I feel like that's the initial spark.
Yeah. Okay. Final.
Thank you both so much. Such fascinating material. Is there anything special about new religions in their relation to American law? Are they important for that because they show us something in their strange specificity? They show us something general about religion and law, or do they have a unique relation to the law?
Do you want to answer that? And I have an answer.
Gee, I could take a stab at it. You go first?
Sure, I would say both of those. I think one reason I'm interested in these groups is they test the limits and test the boundaries of how we carve out the space of the religion. Since the 19th century, and especially since the end of World War II, we've had so many new religious movements emerging and imports from Asia, forms of Hinduism and Buddhism and Sikhism and others, that we're no longer a nation of Protestant Catholic Jew, right, which most of us thought we were up to the 1950s, but now we're a nation of Scientologists and Hare Krishnas and Buddhists and everything else. So they've continually pushed the boundaries of how we classify religion, and in the process they've also raised all sorts of key questions about religious freedom. For example, can Rastafarians smoke ganja as a sacrament? Or can the Native American Church consume peyote as their sacrament? Or can Mormons marry more than one wife? So they both push the boundaries, but also raise these key questions about religious freedom and what its limits are. And who gets to make those decisions that I think are really interesting.
And I think there's also a sense in which there's a productive tension from these quote-unquote new practices, and not so new ultimately, that allows for the asking of these questions about what religion is and renders visible that which is taken for granted before, if that makes sense, right? I mean, I think what we mean often when we mean the mainstream is that which we don't notice, that which we it's become naturalized, and these new religious phenomenon make that visible in their contrast with it.
I would say they also make visible the who decides question that I raised at the end of my presentation. And what I would argue is it's not just scholars, and it's not just courts, and it's not just agencies like the IRS, but rather it's all of these different agents in a complex negotiation that's always evolving. So it's courts and the IRS and the State Department and scholars and anti-cult groups and media and those believers themselves arguing over time, which is why the boundaries of religion are always fluid.
Well, thank you both. Thank you for our panelists. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Countess Donna Human, for having us. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for a great conversation on new religious movements. We hope to see you again for our next discussion. Thank you for coming out.